Okay, I think we have the vast majority of those who are registered now. And as it's a couple of minutes past 11, I'll just continue. So today's speakers, you have myself. I'm proud to be leading ComplyPort Limited, which is a leading technology-led management consulting and regulatory compliance firm in the UK. We look after all types of FISMA and PSR applications. Um, Richard, who will be speaking next, after eventually getting time off for good behaviour from the FCA Authorizations Department, Richard left after 22 years, and he now leads our internal audit practice as well as managing a portfolio of retained clients. Simon, our practice lead for all Section 166 investigations, having either led or been involved in um, investigations for more than a quarter of a century, which he won't thank me for saying, and also our pensions practice lead. Before I move on to the agenda, I just wanted to share some thoughts that we'll explore further into the presentation on internal audit. So some of you are aware, in some European jurisdictions, internal audit is a regulatory requirement for all investment firms. But you can all breathe a sigh of relief because currently that's not the case in the UK. However, that is a slight misrepresentation because, as you'll hear from Richard later, the FCA does make reference to the internal audit standards and have the FCA's own expectations of regulated firms as well in this space. Which is why it's highly pleasing to see so many of you attending today's discussion. But the question that leads nicely is, so why does internal audit matter if the regulators are not making it a requirement? What is and always has been on our regulators' agenda is good governance. And as we know, that starts with the board and cascades down. So the question is, how does the board know that all their business functions, and in particular, the focus of today's webinar, the compliance function, is fit for purpose? And no, the answer is not because their SM 16 or 17 says so. Ha, we wish. Wouldn't life be easier if all stakeholders just accepted our words? But that's not how it works. So one of the answers is that we need independent assurance that everything is working as it should be. A phrase you will hear throughout this webinar, and that is the role of internal audit, independent assurance. That's where an internal audit function comes into its own. Shareholders, stakeholders, employees, regulators derive comfort that an independent firm echoes the words of their compliance team and the management sit more comfortably. So we talk about proportionality. Does that mean that every investment firm needs to have their own internal audit department? Well, of course not, but they do need to have access to a firm that can carry out internal audits, assurance reviews, or health checks. Yeah, such as one like us. Um, for want of a better expression, I can't think of a better analogy. Apologies at the moment, but some of our clients have, when we talk about audits, they have almost what I would call like a full year two type service where everything is looked at, everything is changed, everything is drilled and pulled apart to see how it works. Others opt for a lighter touch audit. It could be like a year one inspection or even as light as an MOT. As appropriate to their needs, size, and scale. And when you have a specific concern, say I don't know, the perennial bane of all of our lives, AML or KYC, we can undertake a very specific and deep dive on that. I should add that other car servicing schedules do exist, and apologies, as do other analogies, but hopefully that set the scene. So now on to the agenda. So just very briefly, Richard will take you through parts 1 and 2. Simon will step in, talk about parts 3. We'll then crystallize everything that we've been discussing over 2 case studies. So Simon will kick off the case studies and then Richard will follow. before Simon comes back, talks about some of the strategies that we have. Then I have a little plug on how ComplyPort can help you, and then we move on to the Q&A. So without much further ado, Richard, I'm just going to pass over to you. We can talk about introduction to
Introduction to
internal
internal
audit.
audits.
I,
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 I
I
will
will
turn
turn
around
around
and
and
say
say
that
that
please
please
post
post
questions
questions
in
in
the
the
chat
chat
box
box
as
as
and
and
when,
when,
and
and
we'll
we'll
deal
deal
with
with
them
them
later.
later.
Over
Over
to
to
you,
you,
Richard.
Richard. Thank you, Kumar. And good morning, everybody. Great to be able to talk to you on this slightly bright Wednesday morning by the looks of things. So as Kumar says, I'm going to do the introductory work here, hopefully doing a bit more to set the scene. So if we can move on to that next slide, please, that will help. One of the things that it's probably crucial for us to think about before we go any further into this is the question of what exactly we mean by internal audit. I think, as we probably all recognise, audit is a term that can be bandied around in our industry on a sort of fairly free and easy basis. But when we are talking about internal audit here, we're talking about something quite specific, quite distinct. We all have processes in our businesses which look at our day-to-day systems, procedures, controls, and obviously we also have MI that helps us to understand what is going on in the business, what these things are telling us. Internal audit, however, goes a bit further than that. It is, as Kumar mentioned previously, it is concerned with two very specific activities, or has two specific characteristics. And firstly, the internal audit is an independent approach to assessment and evaluation, and it is aimed to provide assurance through the audit activity. So this is looking at the question of making sure that things don't just happen, because most of the time we can see that things are happening on a day-to-day basis, but they are working in addition. They are being effective and they are delivering the sorts of outcomes that you would expect them to be providing your business. So with that in mind, I mean, one of the key points for us is that an internal audit used in the right circumstances and against the right backdrop can actually be crucial to the survival of a business. You know, nobody wants to find out too late in the day that things that they thought were the case were not in fact the case, and that things haven't been working as expected. And we'll look a bit more closely at the independence and the assurance characteristics as the webinar flows on. So bringing that now into the focus of regulatory views on internal audit, and in particular here, the FCA, as Kumar mentioned earlier, there isn't a sort of mandatory expectation that these are happening within firms. But what I think we can convey to you today is that there is certainly some immense value in them in the right circumstances. So what does the FCA say here? Well, the first stop really is the handbook, of course, the handbook that we all know and love, and in particular CISC, the high-level standards, senior management arrangements, and in particular CISC 6.1, which is the high-level expectation set by FCA that we're all familiar with and all get. A firm must establish, implement, and maintain adequate policies and procedures sufficient to ensure the compliance of the firm. Sorry for quoting from the handbook, but I can't really sort of say it any clearer than the way that it is articulated there. So moving on from that, from CISC 6.1, we then get to CISC 6.2, which concerns itself with the question of internal audit. And what it's saying here is that firms should, where appropriate and where it's proportionate in view of the nature, scale, and complexity of a firm's business, a firm should establish and maintain an internal audit function. And it goes on to sort of give some indications as to the characteristics of that internal audit function as the FCA sees it, and we'll explore some of those as we go on. So we're looking at a process that is designed as we say, to give independent assurance to the firm's senior management that what is happening in their business is effective. Just having a walk through the slide here, which covers some of the points that I've made. There are some points that I'd like to pick out. In particular, the one that jumps off the page for me is scope, and where it talks about the evaluation of the culture within a firm. So we are not talking so much here about the perhaps conventional tick box approach to compliance. We, depending on what sort of internal audit is going on, it may well be that the recommendations that come back up to senior management will cover issues such as the culture and the approach to compliance, or the approach to running procedures within your business. And this is the value of the internal audit, because it's giving you that independent understanding as to what exactly is going on beneath the bonnet, so to speak. Another critical role of internal audits is providing recommendations. There won't ever be an expectation that an internal audit happens and simply comes back and says, yes, everything is absolutely rosy and you don't need to do anything. You would anticipate or expect a valuable internal audit to come back with recommendations as to where there are instances perhaps of practices that need to be changed, enhanced, or where you have good practice that could perhaps even be transferred to other parts of the business. Moving on to the next slide, again, just sort of honing in on the value of an internal audit in a firm's overall compliance framework. As I say, and I don't apologise for labouring the point. Really, what we're trying to get to understanding here is whether the controls that you have running in your business in relation to things like your risk management, your day-to-day governance, in fact, any particular aspect of your business, which can, depending on the size of your firm, extend to things like your HR function, for example. But, are all of those things working in the way that you would expect and delivering the outcomes? From a regulatory perspective, one of the things that we're sort of very keen to emphasize is you don't really want to be doing your testing to find out whether those things are working at the time at which the FCA comes knocking. If you are suddenly finding out that things aren't working in the way that you were hoping as the FCA is breathing down your neck, then that's probably not a great place to be. So I think the kind of food for thought that comes out of this, and in particular, going back to the point that I made a second ago, taking proactive steps to identify weaknesses or scope for development in your business is hopefully going to ensure that your relationship with the regulator continues to run smoothly on an ongoing basis. And let's not think about things like regulatory penalties, enforcement, and things that can come into play where that's not the case. So moving on to the next slide, it's useful just briefly, hopefully, to take some time to explain the role of internal audit in what's called the 3 lines of defence model. Some of you may already be familiar with this, but looking at this, the next slide on this, please. What that is really trying to convey or underline is the independence, the assurance aspects of internal audit as a function. We all have, and I suspect we all recognise the first 2 items that are detailed here. We have policies and procedures in place that we expect people within our firms to follow on a day-to-day basis. And as a result of that, we would expect that those activities are keeping us afloat and keeping us moving in the right direction. But that in itself, of course, is not enough on its own. We have risk and compliance functions, and Kumar made mention earlier of whether assurance from your SMF 16 is enough to confirm that everything that is happening is what exactly needs to be happening, and that's unfortunately not always going to be the case. So we have what's called the 3rd line of defence, and it's internal audit, where you step over the line into the realms of independence, objectivity, potentially having people involved in reviewing and assessing the workings of your firm who are not internal to the business and who are given a mandate to tell it as it is, so to speak, to explain to senior management that A, you think this is happening, but B, what in fact is really happening is something rather different. Can we have the next slide, please? So finally, for my part here, and bringing this all together, in its role as the third line of defence, internal audit, when it's used effectively, should be able to provide good oversight of those first two day-to-day lines of defence. It will help a firm to understand how effective its governance, risk management, and other controls really are. It will provide recommendations to the senior management about changes that ought to be made to bring procedures and controls into line. And I think that the points that Simon will bring on to will hopefully sort of echo this and will explain the high-level thinking here in some further detail. So yes, that's the introductory aspect of it, and I will hand back to Kumar.
Thank you very much, Richard. Insightful. I really found that the 2 points on the proportional risk-based approach and also the scope and culture to be two key themes that we've seen throughout our audits that we've done. So now I'll hand over to Simon, who will start talking to you about the leveraging internal audits for regulatory compliance. Simon, over to you.
Thanks, Kumar. Okay, I think first and foremost, I've always been told never to start with an apology. I'm going to apologise now because I'm not supposed to be sounding like Barry White, but I do have a very heavy cold, and apologies in advance for anything that actually might may go cross. Next slide, please. Okay, so looking at sort of internal audit objectives and regulatory requirements. As with all business actions, the requirements of the firm have got to align with that of the regulator and the appropriate rules and regulations set by that regulator. Clearly, there are best practice actions that can be followed, but first and foremost, a firm's actions must meet the minimum requirements of its regulator. The internal audit function is the firm's third line of defence, and it should be seen as that, a defence against poor behaviours, a defence against bad customer outcomes, and a defence potentially against regulatory actions by FCA. As such, internal audit must effectively support the organisation's compliance and risk management processes. So to do this, there are a number of clear steps that have to be taken. Firstly, a firm must understand the regulatory environment in which it operates. It may sound a little bit basic as a point, but it's surprising how many firms don't truly understand what's expected of them. They go under the radar a lot. FCA doesn't contact them, but occasionally they can then go off kilter. They need to understand what's the expectations of them. So regulatory expectations and interpretations will change over time, and it's critical that firms keep abreast of these changes. This will involve a thorough understanding of relevant regulations, including both the letter of the law and the regulator's broader agenda and objectives. It will be necessary to define audit objectives. These should be clear and achievable within a set time frame. They must be relevant to the organisation's strategic goals and address areas of greatest risk and/or concern. The audit will identify the risks to the organisation's ability to achieve these objectives, including compliance-related risks. It will prioritise the risks based on the potential impact of the risk on the firm and the likelihood of occurrence, so a classic probability and impact assessment. Just as the firm and the internal audit function requires an understanding of the regulatory environment, they also need to consider the need for strategic audit planning. This will consider the impact of the regulatory environment on the content of the internal audits. What are the hot topics of regulation and risk? What is the regulator looking for in firms going forward? A clear structuring of the audit plan allows more effective compliance monitoring and anticipation of and preparation for upcoming regulatory changes. Lastly, as with all these things a regulated firm needs to do, it is necessary to maintain open lines of communication with the FCA. We've mentioned before, and we'll mention again, the need to keep FCA informed whether it be through the auspices of a Principle 11 notification or any other notification requirements. Firms are expected to have an open and cooperative and constructive working relationship with their regulators. And this is particularly the case with the internal audit function and the outcomes of its actions. Having good relations with the regulator helps the firm to remain aware of its obligations and to respond effectively to changing regulatory expectations. So if that's how the internal audit sees it or sets itself up, how does it go about demonstrating that the firm is meeting the right regulatory standards? We'll cover this on the next slide. So it's important for firm to show commitment to regulatory compliance and, where it has one, to demonstrate the effectiveness of its internal audit function. A firm can do this by maintaining accurate documentation, which is a basic requirement for all firms, no matter what you're looking at in terms of regulatory compliance. It is particularly important in the world of audits, and the audit trail is paramount. We all live and die by the mantra of, if it's not happened, or sorry, if it's not written down, it hasn't happened. So ensure that there is a thorough record of what you've done. You should keep comprehensive audit trails, including detailed records of all internal audit activities, findings, issues, and follow-up actions, such as audit plans, reports, and evidence of relevant mitigation or corrective actions. Without this, there is little to show for all the hard work that we put into these activities. In order to provide the assurance that the audit activities are undertaken to the appropriate quality, it is sensible to adhere to relevant audit standards. As we mentioned before, audits should be conducted in accordance with recognised audit standards, such as those set out by the Institute of Internal Auditors, the IIA. The FCA does not directly refer to IIA standards, but it does set out the expectations that are in line with the principles that the IIA promotes. So this is a good starting point. Internal audit should provide regular reports to the board and senior management, and, when required, externally to regulatory bodies. These would include the outcomes of the audits and progress or actions on potential issues that have arisen. Depending on the nature of the audit schedule, whether discrete subjects are reviewed at different times, or whether it's a comprehensive annual review, the information provided to the firm's senior management must be timely, clear, and actionable. Not all firms are, as we said, required to have formal audits, and not all firms are required to have formal external audits, but many will use the services of external consultants to carry out these external reviews of their business. Where there is some form of external scrutiny, the expectation is that the external party will be independent of the firm, and your internal audit function is highly likely to be in communication with that party. The role of the external auditor is different to that of the internal version, but there are parallels, and there is an expectation that your internal audit function will communicate with the external auditor to make the process more fluid and painless. It is certainly not a them and us situation. The independent auditor can provide assurance or assessment of the effectiveness of the internal audit function, which will show willingness on the part of the firm to open itself up to review and to learn lessons from parties with perhaps a wider range of external experiences. Firms are always expected to have an open, as we mentioned before, an open and effective communication with regulators. So under Principle 11, there must be clear lines of communication with regulators, and this can be used to discuss audit methods, findings, and responses, or other actions, particularly when something has been identified of which the FCA would expect to be notified. This is not to say that an internal audit runs straight to the FCA, far from it. However, once an issue has been identified and internal discussions have decided that a notification is needed and is made, the internal audit is a good tool to use to identify potential notifiable events. Finally, firms will be expected to carry out regular reviews and monitoring of everything they do. There must be a demonstrable commitment to continuous improvement with regular reviews of the internal audit function included in this process. This will ensure that this key function is up to date with regulatory changes and best practices, and provide assurance, should it be needed, to either senior management or to the FCA that the firm is policing itself effectively. Back to you, Kumar.
Thank you very much, Simon. It was one of the things that stood out from your section, and we spoke about this, particularly about understanding the regulatory framework, and we've seen this within our own client base, is um, not updating or modifying their internal audit for things such as a Dear CEO letters or thematic review output or even updated policy statements. And that's why we really do say that you should keep up to date and see what is happening in the regulatory landscape when conducting the audits. Um, I'm actually now going to move back to Simon as he's got the floor, and we will talk about a crystallized example of one of his internal audits that he has recently done. So back over to you, Simon.
Thanks, Cuba, again. Right. Okay. So I think from my perspective, we've done a lot of work over the last, well, a lot of work over all the years, particularly in the last couple of years, where we've been requested to carry out reviews of a number of firms across a very broad spectrum of financial services sectors. In particular, we've been very active in the AFM, host AFM, and principal firm appointed representative space in light of the changes to the regulatory requirements and expectations of relationships between those parties that were augmented in late 2022. In one example of this, we were asked to act as the internal audit function for the firm and to carry out the audit in accordance with the client's audit schedule. However, in addition to the usual items subject to assessment, the review was to have a focus on this particular regulatory hotspot. The firm was concerned that although it understood that its obligations as a principal had changed, that the FCA was seemingly very active on identifying weaknesses in other similar firms, and naturally our client wanted to avoid similar criticisms. And we've seen this a lot in Section 166 reviews and notices over the last 18 months or so. So we were asked to carry out an internal audit review of the whole business, but with specific attention to the new rules and requirements on principal firms. The areas that our client was most concerned with were the onboarding checks on new appointed reps. Were they thorough enough? Was the firm missing any key issues? Were there any skeletons in the closet of anyone related to the appointed rep? And so on. And also whether the ongoing monitoring of the AR's activities were sufficiently detailed and addressed potential regulatory risks. Our review involved a detailed analysis of the firm's risk appetite statement in order to establish whether the practices employed met that risk appetite. We have seen many risk appetite statements that indicate no appetite for risk at all. But then we've seen that the AR's appointments carry out business in high-risk investments and in high-risk jurisdictions. So essentially sort of going against the firm's risk appetite statement. This was not the case with our firm in point, but is an indicator of the discrepancies that the FCA often witnesses. The review also involved interviews with key staff members and reviews of selected documents together with an assessment of sample transactions and relationships with appointed reps. We utilized our own EKYC tool to determine the depth and quality of review of the individuals involved in the ARs that were sampled. We've often found that whilst standard KYC practices are carried out well, what is not so well implemented are the checks of adverse media. This is often simply left to a quicker Google search, but the expectations are now far greater from the FCA. In a recent Section 166 skilled person review that we carried out, the firm involved was criticised heavily for not investigating certain owners of the business who had previously been involved in other businesses where the FCA had been critical and where there had been investments promoted that did not appear to be legitimate. A simple adverse media check would have identified these issues, whereas a Google search did not. And on that occasion, linked the owner to the business and to the other dubious investment. So the review revealed that whilst there were many areas where procedural improvements could be made, particularly in documenting the governance arrangements of the business, the approach that the firm had adopted towards the management and monitoring of its appointed representatives was in line with the enhanced regulatory requirements and expectations. This assurance enabled the firm's senior management to focus its attention on other areas of its business, whilst being confident that the higher risk activities were being carried out satisfactorily. Of course, ongoing standards need to be monitored to ensure that they are maintained, but our report allowed the management to enhance standards in less high-risk areas, whilst being confident that the higher risk activities were being carried out correctly. At the time of our review, we were unable to assess the annual assessment of compliance for each AR, nor were we able to review the firm's self-assessment review and report, as these were not due to be carried out until later in the year. But we did provide valuable guidance to the firm in terms of actually establishing the practices and processes for beginning the preparation for those two new procedures, and that's now been carried out successfully. So that's an example of what we've done in practice. So hand you back to Kumar very quickly.
Simon, again, thank you very much. That was a very insightful case study, mainly because we talked about the firm being good enough, not necessarily gold plating all of their requirements, but being fit for purpose to what they needed. So that was very helpful, and that's a theme that we will constantly talk throughout the rest of the presentation. I'm going to hand over to Richard now, who will talk us and crystallize some of the comments he made earlier in terms of one of his case studies. Over to you, Richard.
Yeah, okay. So the example or the case study that I would like to talk through is hopefully a good illustration of how an internal audit can be used effectively as a part of a firm's compliance framework, but also in particular here to further its own interests, in fact, and to help it develop its business. So the case that I have in mind is a regulated firm that had made an application to extend the scope of its permission, wanting to get into new activities. These were all activities that were envisaged by the firm some time ago and part of the firm's wider growth plan and the evolution of its business model. Lo and behold, however, on the back of some, let's call it some previous interaction with the regulator, the application that they made to extend the scope of their activities hit the buffers in the first instance. There were some challenging questions asked and some doubts expressed over whether the firm really had everything in place that it would need to be able to run effectively and in a compliant basis this new area of business. I don't want to go into too much detail here because I don't want to sort of breach anything like client confidentiality, etc. But let's say there had been some issues identified around client classification procedures. So the firm decided in the face of those challenges from the regulator that rather than simply seeking to rebut those there and then, it would take on board the comments that had been made to it and would walk away temporarily at least and give some thought to how it could most effectively address those challenges. And the decision that was made was in fact that it would be appropriate to run an internal audit in relation to those aspects that the regulator had identified and expressed some concerns about. And this goes back to the point that Simon made earlier about this willingness to subject yourself or open yourself up to some level of independent scrutiny, and it demonstrates or can demonstrate to the regulator that you have a sort of constructive approach to dealing with the sorts of issues that have perhaps been put in front of you. So what happened here was, the internal audit process kicked in. The audit took place under the terms of reference that were agreed. The external consultancy, us in this case, were given the correct sort of mandate from the firm's management. So given license to go and ask the questions that needed to be asked, raise the challenges that needed to be raised, and probably most importantly, provide honest feedback to the senior management. And it's fair to say that the report that was ultimately provided back to senior management did, to a large extent reflect the kinds of concerns and issues that the regulator had originally identified. So this wasn't a case of saying, okay, so you're the senior management, we've done this work, let's just tell you that everything is rosy in the garden. Quite the opposite. In fact, there was a clear need to say, okay, you may think that this is what your firm is achieving, but we've now looked at it from an objective perspective. We have raised the bonnet, and we've looked at the workings that are taking place here, and there are things that need to be addressed. Obviously, at first instance, that's not great news for the senior management, but the value in all of this as an exercise is that they are then able to discuss the reality of the situation and make some sensible decisions as a management team as to what it is that they're going to do to put these things right. So we help them to come up with an implementation plan, to put changes in place, to make sure that those changes were then monitored and tracked to ensure that they have been effective and that they are now addressing the sorts of issues that were identified. And ultimately, a happy ending to this story, that the firm was able to go back to the regulator and say, okay, fair comment. We've taken on board what it was that you had to say to us. We take it seriously. We've put some time and effort into this, and we can play back to you the findings that we have now from an internal audit that has been conducted for us by a third party. This is what was found. These are the areas where we have some assurance that things that we thought were happening are indeed happening. But most importantly, of course, in relation to those areas where the things that we thought were happening were not indeed the case, we have taken corrective action. We are on top of this. We are a responsible management team, and we have addressed those issues. So the happy ending to that story is that there was a positive response to the application at second instance. The regulator took that comfort that the firm had taken these things seriously, taken some sensible and proportionate action, and decided that they could move forward with the application in a positive manner. I do like a story with a happy ending.
Thank you very much, Richard. It was a happy ending, and in the case of that firm, and thank you for sharing that, because that highlights two things. One, by undertaking the independent assurance for the firm, they could objectively understand how they needed to move forward. But equally, the regulators were also given some degree of comfort that an independent assurance was provided. So, yeah, that, as you said, was a happy ending, and to end the story, the VOP ultimately went through. So all good. What we're going to do now is I'm going to hand back to Simon just to talk to you about some strategies that we could use as clients and also as consultants in coming over some of those audit hurdles. So, Simon, over to you, sir.
Thanks again, Kumar. Okay, so strategies for overcoming audit hurdles. Next slide, please. So for internal audit to remain relevant, it must adapt to changing expectations and maintain alignment with the organization's objectives. The internal audit strategy is basically fundamental to remaining relevant and plays an important role in achieving a balance between cost and value, whilst making meaningful contributions to the organization, is the overall governance, the risk management, and internal controls within the business. The key thing to remember, I think, is that internal audit is part of the firm and is there to help the firm achieve at least the minimum required standards. Internal audit is not the enemy, despite what you might think, and is known and is not there to make life unnecessarily difficult. A good internal audit function will work with the business to improve standards beyond what is expected by the regulator. And as we've seen before, a systematic and structured process can be used to develop internal audit strategic plans. helping to enable the internal audit function and activity to achieve its vision and mission. There are many things a firm can do to ensure that any hurdles can be overcome quickly and painlessly. Greater time and great pain tend to be involved where there's a lack of communication between internal audit function and senior management. I suppose the question to ask is, do you know what your business is trying to do and what risks you have? If not, or if not completely, then the internal audit process will be a lot harder. Having a comprehensive risk assessment and mitigation program is critical in minimizing audit problems by targeting the problem areas. Routine activities such as KYC on clients can become quickly ingrained and business as usual. However, as we've already pointed out, the danger here is that they do not move with developments in this particular space, and particularly in the areas of national and international financial crime prevention. And they can quickly become out of date and ultimately dangerous to the business. Ensuring that there is a focus on horizon scanning by other parts of the business, such as compliance, or external compliance consultants for that matter, will help to ensure that current and future practices and standards are adequate and thereby keep the internal audit function happy. But it's not just about having the appropriate policies and procedures. It's about putting those policies and procedures into practice time and time again. So a practical application of the necessary policies and procedures can only really be achieved with staff of the right skills and competencies. If this is achieved through a thorough and satisfactory training program. If the staff are trained well, then this will go a long way to achieving the right outcomes. Let's move on to the next slide, please. So as we've mentioned before, audit hurdles can be avoided where proper preparation is undertaken across the whole firm. Internal audit is there to judge the standards of implementation and to identify regulatory gaps. Its role is not necessarily to alert the firm to changes in regulation. This is usually the function of other parts of the business, of course. But any good internal auditor will flag potential issues coming over the horizon if it's clear that little or no planning is taking place. As such, good business and regulatory planning are a key element of smoothing the audit process and ultimately securing good regulatory outcomes for customers, firms, and regulators alike. This can include actions such as understanding the relevant industry and the firm's objectives. What is the industry and the firm trying to achieve? What are their targets? And how can this be completed? What do FCA source books say must be done? Sometimes the letter of the law is not sufficient if the spirit is not being achieved. We've already mentioned earlier today that the FCA does actually say provides a lot of information outside of its source books in publications such as Dear CEO letters. So what does the FCA want to achieve through these communications? You should be finding this out. Or the internal audit should understand this. It's taken for granted that Dear CEO letters that arrive in your inbox are reviewed and actioned. And if they're not, they must be, obviously. But what is happening in other sectors? If you are looking, or you're not looking at Dear CEO letters of other industry sectors, you may not be aware of what's coming over the horizon for your sector. Internal audit is not immune from being subject to scrutiny as well. So update the internal audit assessment and monitoring review. How effective is your internal audit function? If you don't know, make sure that there is some assessment in the pipeline. This may well be through the external audit program. Also, what are the factors that are critical to success? If you don't know what these are, how can you achieve them? As part of the risk assessment, what are your strengths and weaknesses? Where are the opportunities and threats? What can you do to enhance the positives and minimize the negatives? Do this, and the audit process is suddenly a lot smoother. And the final point to really note, I suppose, is what are your and the FCA's key initiatives? Where should you be focusing your attention? The FCA publishes its outlook and business plan every year, and this, along with other key publications, should be a basic building block on which attention can be focused. to ensure that subsequent audits are satisfactory. A lot of this is already embedded in firms' existing frameworks, but these should be reviewed periodically to ensure that nothing is being omitted or overlooked. Do this, and you will become far better prepared for your next audit, and all concerned, whether it's you, your staff, your clients, or the regulator, will be much happier as a result. So back to you, Kumar.
Simon, thank you very much for sharing those insights, which we have gained over many years of doing internal audits for our clients. And yeah, looking around the corner is definitely something that we have learned has been a benefit. When we spot things that happen in one sector, we quickly make sure that all of our other sector clients have dotted their I's and crossed their T's on that. So thank you for that, Simon. I will now move on and tell you a little bit about how we can support you guys. So, internal audits require deep knowledge and of the regulatory expectations, both set out by the FCA and to give them their full title, the Chartered Institute of Internal Auditors. So we look at their charter as well and the expectations of FCA, and that's how we start scoping and planning the frameworks for our internal audits. Suffice to say, we mentioned this at the start of this presentation. We have extensive experience through Section 166 investigation work, which is very finger on the pulse regulator expectations and requirements, which we overlay on our standard internal audit framework. And we also internally tweak and improve those as well. Being on the FCA Skilled Persons panel allows us to access to insights that even are ahead of Dear CEO letters or public statements, because we understand the direction of travel and the focus of the regulators on a particular area, be that financial crime, be that governance, be that credit risk framework. We've conducted at the firm in excess of over 600 internal audit assignments. So whilst we don't rely too heavily on resemblance or heuristics, we generally know what the marking schedule should be for this and where the pain points are. And as Simon articulated a few moments ago, that was a summary of some of the big areas. So we have proven capability in this field. The other thing that we should also just briefly speak on is that we're a technology-led firm. So we complete audits, assurance reviews, health checks digitally. And what that allows us to do is not only just reduce the paper storage and store your results electronically, but it enables us to track your progress year on year. And in addition, as all clients ask us, where are we benchmark against our competitors or our peer groups? And what we can do from this analysis is show you not only what good practice looks like, but also what good enough practice looks like. And that's what we want to do. So look, here is a slide. It briefly covers our approach on how we do this. Everything is risk-based. It makes sense. It needs to be proportionate. I should add that we have flexible working models. So, if you have internal people undertaking your audits or assurance reviews, we can basically QA them, point them in the right direction and make them that they're good enough. Or equally, we can partner with you jointly together to conduct audits in specific areas, or if you're lacking specific SME knowledge, we can support that. Or alternatively, you can fully outsource it to us and we can get this done for you. Choice is yours. So should you wish to have a discussion on any of these aspects, you can either reach out to Richard, Simon, or myself. So now I'd like to move on to the question and answer section. The chat group is actually quite active, actually. So let's see how many of these questions we can get through. And as we say in old time, any of these that we can't cover today, we'll get back to you with responses. So I'm not the greatest at multitasking, so let me just see how these questions are coming and how we can cluster them. Okay, so look, the first question is, okay, yeah, let me summarize in this. There are several questions similar to this. The question is the frequency. So, Richard, as our lead here, question: how frequently should my firm be conducting internal audits?
Okay, so like so many things in regulation, the answer kind of begins with two words, which are it depends. Unless you are a firm of a particular scale, size, or complexity, it's probably unlikely that you're going to need to have a particular audit cycle in place where you are saying, for example, this particular area gets looked at every 2 years. I think for the vast majority of firms, the answer on frequency is really going to be enough to make sure that what you are doing is meaningful. So making sure that you are honing in on the areas of risk that you know are perhaps higher or prominent within your business, that you're taking account of changing regulatory environment and indeed the world at large. You're looking at things like the results that you've had from previous audits. You know, if you've had an audit and the results generally have been pretty encouraging, then chances are you're not going to want to turn around 12 months later and say, great, let's do it all over again. So as I say, it needs to be something that doesn't become part of the routine. I hope that helps.
That was
Turn. Sorry, I think that's as clear as we can give it. You know, some of our just giving some examples out there for some of the audience. Some of our clients on internal audit, for example, if there's you know, not too many medium or high risk items, we'll probably look at it once every 2 years, some every 3 years. It really depends on the size, scale, and maturity of the firm. So, absolute fair comment. Again, trying to cluster some of these questions and looking at the chat here, I think it's more around prioritization. So, let's say, Simon, maybe you can handle this one. It's what are the key criteria, let's say, for selecting areas to prioritize in an internal audit?
Thanks, Kumar. I guess there's a little bit of overlap with what Richard just mentioned, in as much as what the focus areas are where the risks are. So what's your risk assessment saying? Where are the key areas of risk? What's your risk appetite as a business? You know, if you have got a high risk threshold in a particular area, then actually perhaps you should be focusing where you've got lower risk thresholds. But it depends on where you're active. Equally, what is the regulatory focus? What's FCA looking at the moment? As I mentioned earlier, you know, one of the focus over the last couple of years for certain types of firms has been the relationship between principal firms and their appointed representatives. So I think having an eye open for what the regulator is moving towards is a very good idea. And as Richard did actually mention about previous audits, so if you've actually had a previous weakness, then by definition, and with action points coming out of that, by definition, you should be checking to make sure that those weaknesses have been rectified and they haven't repeated themselves. So I think they're the sort of the key criteria. It's pretty sort of 101 to a certain degree, but actually, you know, where are your problems? How do you identify what the problems are? Risk assessment, and then actually sort of focusing in the attention around those areas. So yeah.
Very comprehensive.
Very comprehensive. Thank you, Simon. I'm cognizant of time. There are so many questions here. I'm trying to cluster them so we can answer most of them as we can. Richard, there's one around, well, a common word comes up on some of these questions, talking about independence and objectivity. How does a firm ensure that they're not compliant, internal audit are not unduly influenced and remain independent and objective? Yeah, what are your thoughts on that?
An interesting one. I mean, I think my first reaction or response to that question is that the tone has to come from the top. And what I mean by that is that, you know, if you are a senior manager within the firm who is looking to make use of an internal audit, you need to have an understanding of what the scope of that internal audit is going to be, and therefore who the appropriate people are to be carrying out that internal audit. Now, in some instances, This may mean that there is a need to bring in people from the outside that you see that you cannot reasonably or realistically expect to have an internal audit carried out on an independent or objective basis using people from your organisation. Sometimes it just simply will not work because of the size of the organisation, the nature of relationships that naturally get built up between colleagues working together under one roof. How on earth can you realistically expect a thorough and independent audit to be carried out in those circumstances? So in terms of other parts of the process to ensure that independence, there need to be very, very clear terms of reference, of course. Everybody who is subject to the audit, but also those who are carrying out the audit, need to understand what the rules of engagement are. Authority needs to be given to those people who are carrying out the audit so that they demonstrably have unfettered access to the information, the records, so on and so forth, that they are going to need to be able to produce meaningful results. And there needs to be a clear indication as to what the reporting requirements are going to be. And so, fundamentally what I'm saying here is senior management commissioning the audit have to grasp the nettle. They have to say, right, okay, to make this work, these are the people who should do it. And this is what we are telling everybody involved on both sides of the equation needs to happen.
Thank you. Wise and sagacious words there, Simon, Richard. Look, we're getting pretty close to reaching the hour now. But Simon, there is just one question which has been repeated so often. I wonder if you could just give a quick 60-second response to on this. And it's basically around from senior managers, what should they be doing in addition to what Richard has turned around there and said about supporting the internal process?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, $64,000 question, I guess, on this one. Going back to a couple of points I mentioned in my earlier sections, internal audit is not the enemy. Internal audit is your friend. Internal audit is there to actually help business do what it's supposed to be doing. So on that basis, I guess, as we hear from a lot of aspects of regulatory compliance, the senior management should be, setting the tone from the top, and other sort of phrases such as that. So leading from the front, they should be supporting, making very clear they support the internal audit function, because without senior management support, then the internal audit function has little sort of authority. I guess I need to make sure that the function itself is adequately resourced. Now, whether that's in terms of personnel, standard, quality, or time available for to do the work. There's got to be sufficient resource, because without that resource, it becomes a very superficial exercise. And I think the other key aspect, I think, is having recognised that they are supporting the internal audit function, is actually to demonstrate that I guess that the results are taken seriously, that they're implemented in an appropriate manner, and that the whole sort of process from start to finish is viewed as a sort of a boon, an advantage to the business. And so to be able to do that, you have to show that, whatever the outputs are being taken seriously. So I guess that would be my recommendation.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Simon. And thank you, to the audience as well. We have several, well, dozens of questions actually, that we will get back to you individually raised. We know who you are, and we'll get those back to you. Thank you for attending. Appreciate the questions and the engagement. As said, we will share with you the recording and the slides post this event. So all that's left for me to say is thank you very much for attending. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon, and it looks like it is sunny out there now. So Richard, I think you were on the mark. So thank you very much, everybody. And yes, we'll be in touch very soon. Bye bye for now.